Head on Fire is a Patreon-supported podcast. Supporters of the show get early access to ad-free episodes, a private Discord server, archives, and more. All benefits are offered on a sliding scale, so no matter your level of donation, you never miss out. If you like this show, consider supporting it with $1 a month or whatever you can at patreon.com/headonfirepod. Thanks, and enjoy the show. We are in an era of remakes and reboots and revivals and retellings of stories that were just remade and rebooted and revived and retold less than a decade ago. An era of cinematic universes whose stories sometimes don't feel like they go together. Characters that seem to suddenly change in power and personality. Sometimes it can be enough to make even the most chill moviegoer wonder where all the new ideas are. But this isn't anything new in storytelling. The Greek myths are pretty much the blueprint for the modern cinematic universe. The way we tell stories, hero stories, adventure stories, sword and sorcery stories, all stem from the gods of Mt Olympus and the lives they meddled in. The wars they waged, the petty grievances they exacted upon one another. But these are more than just stories. They're the narrative of a very real people, the history, if often allegorical, of a very real place where these very real people still live. These gods still have worshippers from within that culture all around the world, and these gods have worshippers from outside of that culture all around the world. With thousands of years of their own retellings and reimaginings that have taken the stories of Greek gods and heroes out of their culture of origin and sprinkled them about as though they are their own separate thing. This has led to some struggle as Greek scholars, Greek people, and Greek culture enthusiasts, for lack of a better term, are all colliding in recent years to ask who these gods belong to and who should be centered in the telling of their stories. Angelo Nasios is one such scholar asking these questions. He has a master's degree in ancient history, is an author writing about the history and practice of Greek religion from within the culture itself, and is the host of the podcast Hearth of Hellenism, where he explores this murky intersection in depth. And he is my guest today. Here's Angelo Nasios. Angelo Nasios, welcome to Head on Fire. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited. I have been mainlining your show, which is Hearth of Hellenism. Is that right?
Correct.
So for folks who don't know you or your platform, tell people a little bit about yourself and what it is that you do.
So what do? So the Hearth of Hellenism blog and podcast is a relaunch of the blog that I had originally on Patheos Pagan. That was back in 2017, and it went on until 2019 when I left Patheos. And then, pandemic hit, and we all went into, this limbo for a couple of years. And then I finally relaunched it last year. And I do, I talk about Greek history, culture, religion, polytheism, specifically the ancient religion. I'm very interested in those things. I am a practitioner of Greek religion, so I am a polytheist. And that's kind of what I do. And what I also do is I point out and talk about appropriation specifically and how Hellenism is appropriated in the pagan community more broadly.
But you're not just coming at this from somebody who, grew up reading some books or watching some shows and got interested in it. You went to school for this.
Yeah, so I went for undergrad in religion and then for history as my master's.
Yeah, so I think that it's interesting that you have these kind of intersections of expertise in something that most of us took a class on in sixth grade. So actually, that's kind of where I want to start. So for most of us, the idea of Greek culture, Greek religion, is really all wrapped up in Greek mythology, which for a lot of us here in the United States, if you're a kid in the US, you had a little unit on Greek mythology. I had it in sixth grade. It rocked my socks because I feel like, especially for a certain age group, you were either a dinosaur kid, an Egypt kid, or a Greek mythology kid. And I I was absolutely the Greek mythology kid. Like I was a 10-year-old walking around with Arthur Cotterell's Encyclopedia of Mythology, which may I show you?
Yes.
I still have, but I read it so much as a child that like the spine is broken. It's like all separated from its binding. And I had to go out and buy a second copy to keep on my shelf.
Yeah.
Because my copy was far too well loved. Anyways, but for folks like me, whose introduction into this world was, a unit when you were a kid, what's the difference between what we think we know and what it is that you actually study?
Okay. So I think the distinction needs to be made between mythology and then theology. Theology just talking about the gods, literally as the word it means. So mythology is part of theology in the sense that, the myths talk about the gods, but the actual, what does the religion entail? What do you see in the religion, the religious practice? Mythology will inform religion in terms of the establishment maybe of a cult or festivals, things that there's an interplay between mythology and actual praxis. But the mythology itself, so where I would draw the line is in terms of like the gods themselves. So, people will say like, oh, how could you worship those Greek gods? Zeus does horrible things. Like the gods are petty. I think that's the thing when you take a unit, like say on Greek history or things like that, they very much specifically focus on the Homeric representation of the gods and their human character, their human nature. And to me, that is very more of a pop culture or like the common way to approach things, let's say in the ancient world, like what is in society, what does the farmer think versus what does the philosopher think? You're going to get two different approaches to that. Maybe the farmer does, think in terms of, the gods having personality and, I don't want to offend. Maybe they're going to I'll anger the god and they're going to punish me. Maybe they have that mentality. But if you go to Plato, they're not going to necessarily have that sort of like perspective. So I think that's usually what's often always overlooked when you study the ancient Greek society and culture. They will push the philosophical, the mysteries, the deeper understanding of things more towards the side and marginalize that as like philosophers disagree, but that's just the opinions of elite men, and that's not really representative.
I do want to very quickly define a term that some listeners somewhere who are not familiar with studying religions or theology in any kind of way might have a red flag suddenly come up. You said the word cult earlier, which for anybody who's ever studied any kind of religion, we all know what you're talking about. But for those who are unfamiliar with the term in a more historic sense or in a formal religious studies sort of sense, could you define the word cult?
So cult is, in its most basic sense, is the care of a god. So, the cult of Dionysus, for example, would be just, the group of people who would be in that association, maybe affiliated with the temple, a priestly caste of priests or members, and they would just, worship that god, have a temple, for example, and the cult is essentially the cultivation or you get the word culture. It's all rooted in this same word of caring for and cultivating something. So it's not like the modern usage of the negative sense of a cult. And even cult itself isn't used in religious studies. They don't use that word because it's problematic.
So it's not the ancient QAnon then?
No, thankfully not.
So one of the things that I'm always interested in whenever I read academic writing from somebody that actually, does the formal study like you do and actually does this investigative work into history is the way that modern perspective has been able to coalesce an entire narrative, to turn all of ancient Greek myth into a single unified narrative that becomes this single unified story. If I pick up Edith Hamilton's mythology, I can see everything from the creation of the world to its destruction and all points in between. You can do something similar with Norse mythology. There's the Norse creation myth, and it goes all the way to Ragnarok. And it's easy whenever we're looking at all of this from 2023 eyes to think, oh, well, every Greek, every person of this ancient religion, ancient people, believed all of this in this order, all of this in this format, all of this to be factually true, all of this to be the way the world worked. Is that in your understanding accurate? Was there this great coalesced, unified narrative that was understood by ancient people, or not?
I definitely think that is present to a certain degree. It depends on how you approach certain things. I like to examine things in terms of scale and layers. Like I always say, everything is stratified. Everything's very stratified. What topic, what genre, what school of thought. But if you want to take like a very large scale view of the ancient Greek world in its totality, so we're talking about like 1,000 years. Let's just say 1,000 years from like, let's say, classical to late antiquity. The end. So like 500 BCE to 500 CE, that 1,000 years. And you want to do an evaluation, I think you could, construct a grand narrative of a very unifying thought. And of course, there's always exceptions to that. So if you look at, for example, education in this, 1,000-year time period, for example, what was the bedrock of the education in the Greek world? It was Homer. Everyone knew Homer, like how we would probably, know the backstories of superheroes, for example. We all know like Batman's backstory and his childhood and how he became Batman and all these sorts of things. That's it's just in the atmosphere here,
Mm-hmm.
So like for the ancient people, in the Greek world, the Hellenized world in the East, after Alexander, they used Homer to educate themselves, to learn to write and read. It was all based on Homer. So everyone knew all the stories based on Homer. So that's like a very, just basic broad education level. So whatever you can get out of Homer, people would refer to Homer and quote him and, make references to Homer, like, how we make memes today, how we will quote a movie line, people would quote Homer. So there's that. And then you have mystery cults. So you have the Eleusinian mysteries, you have Orphism, you have all these different cults. So, and the cults, I think, all have very similar teachings to them. So, at a certain point, you have different cults, different initiations, different mysteries, but very similar threads and thoughts and what they're trying to teach and what they're trying to give to the people. And so I think that there is common understanding, common discourse, and whatever arguments that are being had and the back and forth, let's say philosophically speaking, between the different schools of thoughts, they're all having a conversation within a cultural context, so I think you have unifying thoughts and streams of ideas, and then you have disagreements, but it's all it's all contained in some sort of context. There's a context to it, a vocabulary, terminologies, and they're all working these things out.
I do find it interesting how often the myths seem to disagree with themselves or rewrite themselves. I was just recently re-listening to Mythos by Stephen Fry, and he'll make references to, in one version of this myth, this happens, and in one version of this myth, this happens. So even in this grand unifying narrative, there are differences of opinion. There's different ways of telling the story. There's different outcomes. It's a very kind of choose your own adventure style of reading it. From an academic perspective, why does that occur? And is it? Lots of different theories that these stories were created or retold at different points in Greek history, or it's like you kind of brought up earlier. Well, what does the fisherman believe versus what does the scholar believe? How is the story told in this town versus how is the story told in that town? Why will, folks who are doing a casual read of something like a mythos by Stephen Fry, how do these differences in myth come about?
I think primarily it is all about localization and where the myth is being told. So instead of, like say the Bible that has, like a very firm narrative, but even the Bible, you have different versions. The Gospels, again, even in a religion such as Christianity, which is very systematized, you have like, the 7 last words of Jesus, like each gospel has a different thing that he says. Well, what is, so so you look at the Greek perspective where there isn't a systematized, version of that. Things are very localized. So the myths will take on local characters based on where it's being told. So, like who is the parent of such and such a figure? Like the Dionysus has different, mothers, depending on what tradition. And I think it's just, based on that local tradition and how it has to then maybe adapt to a new tradition coming in. And so it keeps previous versions in and with the new version coming in, if that makes sense.
It does, and it actually leads me to another point that I don't know if I ever actually heard this in a classroom or if it was more in kind of these informal talks that you'll listen to. But there's this idea, this explanation that the reason why Zeus was so prolific in his couplings was because as this, again, I'm the idiot asking the expert. As the worship of Zeus spread, they had to have an explanation as to why this local deity now had to bow down to Zeus. So it was easier to create a story where Zeus had coupled with that deity to explain, like, oh, Zeus came in and now had babies or something. Does that share any relationship with academic thought, with the way that you all understand how these stories happen, or is that just something we made up on the internet?
No, it's hard to kind of remember where these things come from in terms of like where I read it, but this is something that it's out there in terms of like, migration patterns when different people come down into the Greek peninsula. Zeus, comes down into the region.
Literally.
Seriously, yeah. And, so it's a theory. It's one of the theories of, Greek history and religion is, as Zeus enters, the people who brings, now again, not Zeus entering. I caught myself there. It's
how many sex jokes can we make about Zeus in 3 minutes? Let's go.
It's people bringing the worship of Zeus down into the region with them, and the local deities then assimilate to this new system. That's why Zeus has many consorts. So all the local goddesses of the region would then become consorts with Zeus, and it localizes then Zeus's influence in that region. What's going on here? The old, the continuity from the old into the new. That is academic discourse over that subject. So that's kind of outside of how the tradition would understand those things. Like if you were like a person back then.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to get into a little bit of some of that discourse and the way that modern eyes look back on these myths, and the culture generally speaking, but really the myths where we look back on these ancient stories with modern eyes and give modern judgment towards these stories and the way that the gods behave or the way that people behaved. I know that, there's been a lot of discussion online lately that, ancient Greek society had either a very different understanding or no understanding at all of what we consider today to be things like gender identity, gender expression, sexuality, the concept of homosexuality, the concept of bisexuality is something that we've kind of invented and projected into the past. Is that something that you're able to speak on or speak to in your area of study?
Yeah. So yes, definitely. So from a historical point of view, when we talk about the ancient world and when we project onto the past our modern labels, we have to be very aware that we're doing that to avoid anachronisms. So like again, if you're on Twitter or on Tumblr, you see this all the time. People just saying, like, oh, Using the word of, like, let's say, Alexander was gay. Alexander the Great was gay. He was bi, for example, like that. Or the heroes, or Hercules, or calling people in the past gay, for example. I don't think that is appropriate because those labels didn't exist back then. So they didn't have that kind of psychological sort of society, didn't treat people that way, and had a label and sub communities, how we identify in our communities today. So there isn't that parallel. So I'm trying to think of where to bring this now to.
Well, I mean, I think that it's interesting because, I don't know. I feel like people have begun to use those kinds of labels and use those kinds of reflections as both a point of contention to say, oh, you're doing this wrong, or you're thinking about this wrong, of judgment, to project, like you said earlier, that the gods were petty, or that the gods were jealous, or that certain people were a certain way because they did or didn't do this thing in this story. Whereas I feel like all of that, from my cursory understanding of this subject, it's just not a thing that we could possibly be doing. Like, we can't connect those directly. So saying that the gods are petty, or saying that this was, it is projecting modern sensitivities onto ancient religion, ancient people, into a ancient belief system that just did not even have those concepts, and may not frame those stories, may not frame those things the way that we would frame them today. Like, I know, in a similar vein, not the same thing, but in a similar vein, I know you've talked about, with Sarah Iles Johnston, about the concept of witches in ancient Greek myth, and how what we call a witch today, and the kinds of definitions and meanings that we ascribe to that word, were not at all shared by ancient Greek culture. That concept just didn't really exist back then, not in the way that we understand it now. So I think that in the same way, there are so many kinds of concepts, so many ways of looking at the world and of assigning judgments onto deities and peoples and cultures and actions that we are doing, that they wouldn't even have that framework. Is that right?
I think so. Yeah. You have to, when you're studying the past, you have to really approach the past from their point of view and try to get into their shoes in terms of how do they look at society, how do they categorize things. That's like one of the things as the historian, like how do you like, for example, like sexuality in the ancient world, how do you understand that? And like, to me, I just think that, so our sources are mostly skewed towards the Athenian context. So when people say, "Oh, the ancient Greeks," well, you're basing your idea of the ancient Greeks based on a lot of what you have from Athens, and then the rest of the city-states, it's the sources and what you have, it will vary in terms of what's left behind.
I like that you bring that up, because it's very similar to saying something like, oh, in 100 years, we're talking about, well, what did people in the United States believe 300 years ago? And it's just, what did people in New York believe? Versus what did somebody living out in the middle of nowhere in Wyoming, how did they frame what was happening around them? How did they frame different kinds of things? And I think that that's so interesting that we understand that because we're living in this, but we can't seem to project that onto Greece for some reason.
So that's something that we need to be aware of. Like, what are our sources? Where's the bias in the sources? Where do we lack sources? And be cognizant of that. And when we're reconstructing, like what did so and so believe in terms of sexuality or gender or all sorts of things, you have to really look at the sources of the time period, and then who is writing. So again, going back to like discourse, when I converse with people, in my conversations online, there's a lot of jumping between time periods. I've noticed where people will, they'll start here and then they'll go to the Hellenistic or maybe this period, and they kind of conflate things and they project onto the past some stuff, and it gets very jumbled. And I have to like kind of like, like your phone charger cord and it's all tangled. I had to like untangle the cord and be like, okay, let's untangle this and let's kind of put everything into order.
So I like that. Something that is similar in your work and another former guest of the show, Dan McClellan, who does a lot of work with like biblical scholarship. Mm-hmm. And dispelling fact from fiction when it comes to people's, I like how he phrases it, renegotiations of the Bible. Mm-hmm. Something that is similar in your work and advocacy as his is that you emphasize doing your research, and that the idea that like reading from a book, a lot of people will say things like, oh, I do my research, and then they'll show you their stack of books. Yeah. It's like, oh, well, I've done my research. I'm now an expert because I've read these. Here's all the books that I've read. And then they'll say a whole lot of stuff that's like, once again, taking very modern sensibilities and projecting it onto the past. And then you go look at the books that they read because they think, oh, well, I've read books. I now know. Yeah. But I think what a lot of correct, because I think what a lot of people don't understand is that just because you've read a book doesn't mean that you've done the thing that you think you've done, because reading a book means that you are trusting that the person who wrote that book understood the subject well enough to be an authority on that subject. Something you've talked about in previous interviews, something that he talks about in his platform, something that a lot of different kinds of scholars talk about are just things like translations. Yeah. The reason that somebody will craft an entire narrative, they'll craft an entire point of view, write books on it, multiple books, based on an incorrect translation that they never bothered to check. Turns out they don't even speak the language. They don't speak ancient Greek. They don't speak Aramaic or Hebrew or whatever it is. They don't actually speak that. They are also relying on translations, which were also incorrect. And now we have a better understanding of that. How does the interested person go about doing the research while making sure that they are critical of what they're reading and of the authors that are writing it?
Yeah. So you can always, when you're reading a book, you can always contact the author. I've done that. Like, I'll be reading academic, books and stuff from professors, and I'm like, I'll be like, is this person still alive? And I'll Google them. Like, oh, they are. It's like, depending on if it's a new book or an old book. Like, I don't know if these people are still around or whatever. But I'll read, like, let's see, like, can I get their contact info? Are they on Twitter? And I'll email them.
I'd never in a million years thought your answer was going to be, well, just ask the author.
Yeah, just ask the author. Seriously, I go, if you can get it straight from the horse's
mouth. Please don't email me. Please don't email me, people. Please don't. If whatever I said was probably wrong, it's okay. I'm fine.
But no, honestly, especially when it comes to like academics, professors who are publishing, I do think most of them do like being contacted because it's very hard to find people who are interested in these topics. So when someone gets an email saying, "I read your book," and I have a question about XYZ thing, I think they like that. And in my experience, when I've emailed professors, I'm like, "Oh, I read that." I go, "Or can you help me? Like, I'm a student of history. Do you have?" They're more than happy, I think, on average, to be like, "Oh, here's a recommendation. Here's the clarifying." Like, they like that shit, I think. So
here's what I love. Here's what I love. Okay, I love talking to nerds who are legitimately nerds in a particular subject, who have formal academic expertise in a subject. And when I say reading a book, you are talking what I mean when I say read a book, and what you heard when you heard read a book. We're talking about two different kinds of books. Mm-hmm. Your kind of book is like written by a professor. It's published by a university press, and it published 30 copies. that author is thrilled that anybody knows their name. But when I mean read a book, I mean somebody like, I read Song of Achilles, and now I'm trying to reach out to Madeline Miller to ask her what she meant by this interpretation in chapter 12 of Song of Achilles, where she's never going to she's never going to see your email. She's never going to email you back.
You never know. Maybe, tweet them if they're on Twitter.
That's true.
I would on Twitter first. I'm like, if you're on Twitter, you're there to communicate.
That's true. I have talked to Alice Hoffman once, though she doesn't claim to be a scholar of anything.
Professors, if someone is, teaching teaching a university, you can find their university email on the campus website. So you can just email them, and they in my experience, they do like that. Like it's like, oh, like this is
just ask the author.
Just ask the author. Ask the author. I think and also just try to find the newest books that are coming out. Also, so if you're interested in a particular subject, find out what is the latest book that is out on the topic. So, for example, like Greek religion. If you're interested in Greek religion, everyone likes to recommend, read Burkett, Greek religion. It's written from like 40 years ago. And Sarah Johnston, where we were talking about that on my podcast, where there's her husband is writing a new book coming out soon that's supposed to be like the updated kind of, hopefully the replacement of Burkett. And it's like there's new information that needs to be put out there. And I feel like a lot of people, when it comes to, let's say, within the pagan community or polytheism, they're reading older books sometimes a little too much, and there's gaps there. So go and find out what's the newest books that are coming out. What are the newest theories? What's the conversation being had? I like to recommend people to get a copy of the Oxford Handbook to Greek Religion, because there's a lot of chapters in there about very specific things that are niche topics. So, and also find books that are specifically on individual topics. So something that is not a broad overview, but goes into a specific thing. So a book on, if you're interested in mystery cults, find a book that's specifically only on mystery cults. If you want to learn about the death and how, ancient culture dealt with death and the afterlife, get a book that's specifically on that. So find books that are specifically on those topics.
I like that advice, and I would give the same advice. I think that people also might want to temper that with an understanding of where they are in their own scholarship. If I am interested in science, if I am interested in gardening, and I want to learn more about that, going and picking up a book on organic chemistry written by a professor who's published through a university press and is writing for an audience of other scholars is probably going to leave me very confused.
Yeah.
Is probably going to be maybe even off-putting to somebody that doesn't have enough kind of prerequisites, right? Which is why colleges require prerequisites before you can take certain kinds of courses, because you need a foundational understanding of a topic before you can kind of climb that ladder. And I feel like at times people are so willing, or not so willing, so eager to kind of prove that they're serious about their scholarship, that they dive a little too far. And then what happens is they will read something that is way above their current understanding. And then they will come online to say, hey, I read this. I'm real confused. Don't understand it. Could somebody explain it to me? And then they get somebody that also does not understand it correctly, who explains it to them. Correct. Who explains it to them incorrectly. Do you have a soft introduction to these topics for folks who are interested in it, either just because, hey, I read these myths as a kid and I really liked Stephen Fry, and I think it's cool when Neil Gaiman writes a book about this kind of stuff, this is fun. I'm interested in it from the MCU. I want to learn more. Yeah. I read Percy Jackson. I'm curious. Do you have a couple of softer introductory books to recommend?
I think I would first recommend is Forget the Myths. As shocking as it says for people, like for example, like with me, like I grew up knowing many of the myths, but I'm not somebody who sits down to read every myth. And like I have favorite myths, but I know what the myths are there for me when I need them. I can go and look them up and read them and get whatever I need, the teaching I need out of it, for example. But I'm not like, when it comes to mythology, I'm not like the expert specifically on mythology. And I would advise people to like not focus so much on the myths and kind of like put that aside and just go and study the actual like religious life of religion itself, how it was done, the theories on religion, stuff like that. So if you're looking for specific books, what would I recommend? Again, Oxford Handbook of Greek Religion. It's like $45 on Amazon, I think, on paperback. Coping with the Gods.
Ooh.
That's a really good one. I really like that book. I forgot the name is escaping me at the moment.
That's okay. People have Google. It's fine.
Yeah, Google. It's called Coping with the Gods. Again, that one might be pricey, but I'm just thinking of.
I bet your library can get it for you for free.
Yes, that too. You can also go to the library and do an intraloan. So that's always a possibility. Drawing Down the Moon, not Margaret Adler. It's Edmund. Again, the names, I'm bad with author names, but it's a purple cover, and it's called Drawing Down the Moon: Ancient Magic in the Ancient Greek World. I think something like that. If you look that up.
Oh, I was gonna say, I was like, listen, I've read Margot Adler. I don't remember.
Not that one. It shares the same title, but it has a different subtitle to it, and it's a purple cover. That one's a great book on the conversation of magic. So if someone's interested in magic in the ancient world, go to that book. It's very good. I will have to probably make a list.
Please do. We'll put it in the show notes if you want to email one over.
I'll have to. Let's do that. I'll get back to you, and I'll give you like a list of books people should read. Yeah.
And through the magic of podcasting, if you look in the show notes right now, you'll see the list that Angelo put together for you. Congratulations. Speaking of books, what is your relationship? Do you have any like animus, or do you love books like Percy Jackson? What are the thoughts of these sort of modern retellings of Greek myth for a young, inquisitive audience that likes hero stories?
I think it's just entertainment, you know. So like, because I'm a polytheist, I'm always very torn towards these things. You know, if I was just your run-of-the-mill Greek person who, is either Orthodox or atheist, because I think most Greeks are not really religious. So, their opinion on it would be like, whatever. Like, there's not strong opinions of things for most people. Me being, really into the history and also being a polytheist. So these books being written for like, just the general audience, I try to accept it for what it is, as entertainment, and try not to get too annoyed or whatever. Like, whatever it is, it's entertainment, What I don't like is if there's certain ideas introduced in those books that are getting picked up and then getting brought into religious life. That's where I get a problem. Or just,
can you give me an example of what that might look like?
Yeah. So American Gods. Like his whole theology of how gods, need worship to get power, like that idea, and that's something also you find in Supernatural, the TV show. Yeah. Like,
gosh, I remember that episode way early in the life of Supernatural, where they were all in a diner or something like that, and they fought I remember Kali was like throwing fireballs or something like that. Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. And so it's like this sort of theology, this pop cultural theology that's being written, which by the way is inferred by monotheism. So it's always going to be distorted because these writers, the culture around us, the audience is living in a monotheistic world, and so how do you write stories about gods? You have to frame them in. Well,
and that was so interesting. It's interesting that we kind of talked about Supernatural there, because the way that they ended up telling that framework is that, sure, yes, the ancient Greek gods and Hindu deities and all of that, they're all very, very powerful. And yet they do still all bow down to the Christian God, who is more powerful than all of them.
Yeah, fuck that. So when those ideas then trickle into polytheism as practitioners, it becomes a problem. And it becomes even more a problem when you have people saying they do Hellenism and then introduce those ideas into quote unquote Hellenism. It's making a mess of things. And also, like with Percy Jackson particularly, I have quoted, there's this article that someone wrote called about the latent white supremacy within Percy Jackson, and how there's a dialogue in the book where Percy asks, like, well, why is Mount Olympus on the Empire State Building? And the answer basically was, the gods are like part of the heart of the West.
The heart of the West. When you brought up Western civilization earlier, I wanted to ask you about
what
that.
What the fuck is this bullshit again? So it's just like, again, these narratives and how people tell stories, and they want to be like, oh, well, wherever the power of the West is, the gods go there. And it was in Greece, and then it was in Rome, and then it went to England, and now it's in America. And this is the answer in the book. Mm-hmm. And I'm just like, this is fucked up. I mean, like, and then that idea trickles maybe into polytheism or into spiritual communities where it's like, oh yeah, the gods move across civilizations, and they actually like leave people. Because if you if you take Percy literally, that framing, the gods are actual beings that actually physically move and leave places, and they go to cultures, and then they leave them. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a problem. If people take that too seriously and try to bring it into a religious community and give it legitimacy through religious identity, instead of just leaving it where it should be, which is modern fiction.
So something else that people do in the modern day, actually, before I get to that, recently there's kind of been some scuttlebutt that there on the internet that there's an anthology of Greek myths, retellings, adaptations, that kind of thing, different short stories that have been compiled into this new anthology. Yes. And none of the authors are Greek, I believe.
Yeah, so I saw that on Twitter, and from what I saw from the conversation, and I'm actually was really impressed by everyone's sort of allyship and support of the Greek authors. So from what I understand there was the anthology, there was Greek retellings, and there were no Greek authors included, even though there were Greek authors who submitted to be included. So they submitted their stories, and none of them were included.
So it gets to this point for me that when people think Greek myth, Greek culture, they think whatever that was, whatever all of that belonged to, the stories, the culture, the religion, the study, all of it, it all is now a single unified narrative that has been time locked and shoved into the past and is thousands of years ago. And all of that is dead and can be just resurrected and played with and rearranged and reinterpreted at whim, because those people don't exist anymore. Those people are in the past. All of that is in the past. And I think people forget that Greece is a real place.
Yes.
With real people who still live there, whose roots are in the self same place. Yeah. So while I understand and respect that when it comes to this conversation of appropriation versus appreciation in the US, there is an intersection with things like other intersections of marginality, race, class, ethnicity, that kind of thing, where when people talk about appropriation, they oftentimes think, okay, well, you in the United States are somebody that we would codify in that very American lovely idea of whiteness. Well, we're all white, and we can't do an appropriation to a white person or any white culture at all. All of it's for everyone's taking. I feel like that is the permission that people give themselves. Yeah, you're white, I'm white, everybody's white.
That's still colonial thinking.
I can just sneak on in here and just be like, no, I'm going to take that. And nobody can say bunk because we're all white here. And to an extent, I understand why that thinking exists, because it comes from a sensitivity, a growing and correct sensitivity that, Black Americans have had it a whole heck of a lot worse than white Americans. Yeah. No matter what flavor of white you are, Black Americans have had it a whole lot worse. Hispanic Americans, Latino Americans, Asian Americans had it a whole heck of a lot worse than the rest of us, and do to this day. And yet, there is still a conversation that can be had about the appropriation of a culture that is not actually dead, that is still very much in a place that still exists and of people that still exist and might want to be a part of retelling their own stories.
Yeah, exactly.
So, from your perspective, why is it important for Greek authors to be involved in these modern retellings? What is it that other authors, like I think you brought up that Rick Riordan, I think is how you say his name, kind of gets some things wrong, even in his very well-meaning and very beloved adaptation, his modern retellings in the Percy Jackson and that universe. I think nobody thinks that he had any kind of ill intent. Mm-hmm. And I don't want anybody coming away from this episode thinking that we are doing some Rick Riordan bashing, because I think he's about as good faith as it gets when it comes to authors out there. But there are still some ideas, still some ways of thinking, still some perspectives that folks outside of that culture get wrong in their retelling. So what is the importance from your perspective of Greek authors and Greek voices being included or prioritized in the retellings of these stories?
Well, I think it's just inappropriate in terms of respect. If you're going to, for example, do an anthology of Greek retellings of stories, that it's literally the word Greek is in a Greek myths. And if you're not going to include Greek authors, apply that to any other culture. And I think people would see how it's wrong, but because how you say, people approach it as whiteness, it's not seen, so it's not obvious. So I try to not have double standards. I think if we try to apply the same standards across the board, if you're in America, you're an American writing a retelling. Why are the American authors allowed to be the majority and the only people who can be included in a book, but for some reason to suggest that a Greek author should be included is problematic, or it's not being inclusive. It would go against the idea of being inclusive if you include the Greeks, because somehow I don't know what's the logic behind it, because you're already Greek, so you don't need to be represented in your own culture and history and heritage, which I think it's hard for me to figure out what's the logic between whoever made that decision on, for example, that anthology. What was the thinking process? Because I'm pretty sure the stories you can't say all the stories were bad that the Greeks wrote. You know what I mean? So there's something else there.
Clearly, they're kind of the stories that inform the way that we tell a whole heck of a lot of other stories.
Yeah. So if the ancient Greeks were good enough to write myths that everyone wants to still read about, but the modern Greeks aren't, and we need to not include them. Let's silence them. I find it problematic. And our own perspective, I think it'd be interesting just to also hear, what do we have to say? What is our lives like now? What stories do we want to include? Because we have our own experiences. If you're like for me, I'm in the diaspora. I live in the United States. My father was an immigrant. So if I were to write a myth, I think it would be really interesting, from that perspective as a Greek with, dual identity and the struggle of your upbringing and then assimilating to American society, that how would I transform that and put into a mythic setting, and that would be a very unique story to tell, that maybe someone else wouldn't write. And then now take that as someone living in Greece, what kind of myths and stories they could tell in the modern Greek setting where the ancient myths were told. It's just you're excluding stories that should be included.
So a lot of what your public scholarship and your work has been as of late is talking to people who are making different levels of attempt to revive, to reconstruct. I think is the very popular term, reconstruction, Hellenistic reconstructionism or something like that, where a lot of folks, especially younger folks, are wanting to become worshipers of a certain deity, this kind of idea of working with different kinds of deities and different pantheons and stuff and different cultures has become very, very, very popular, especially with the advent of social media. TikTok has been a big deal about it, but before that it was Tumblr, before that it was Facebook, where social media has kind of like it's turned it into this kind of Pokemon style thing where we got to catch all the deities.
Gotta catch them all the gods.
You gotta catch them all. You gotta have all the deities. You'll see people talking about, online that they work with, 17 different deities, all from different cultures and different points in history. And it's very interesting to see how they negotiate that. But it's also interesting because we're talking about this difference between like information and context and lived experience, and to see the ways in which the gods, the stories and stuff are kind of given this Pokemon style plug and play thing, in that there are these like types and cross types. And it's like, oh, this deity is for love. This deity is for love and war. This deity is for death and motherhood. This deity is for this and this. And and it's like, I don't quite know how we get that.
Yeah,
if you have read the stories,
I think it comes from older scholarship in terms of like, Aphrodite, goddess of love. So this whole idea of like god of this, goddess of that, this categorization, I do think comes from the classical studies.
I didn't know. I thought that was something that was more pop culture stuff that we assigned to it. I thought
it does come from older scholarship, and I think in the book I recommended, Coping with the Gods, they talk about that. How to like that paradigm, and how do you actually approach the gods? Like, what were their attributes? What were they known for? And how do we approach them instead of like a category of god of X? It's more of a map and a network of gods and how they interconnect with everyone. This is academic, approach and trying to understand these things. So, and I think just because of that, from the classical studies, I think that's where it might primarily come from. And then it trickles down into pop culture, and you get what you see in common discourse.
So I don't want to make it a whole thing, but there is, one of the things that you do is help people understand the difference between how these deities and how this culture is talked about on social media by these, you mentioned up top, by people who say that they fall under that umbrella of Hellenism or Hellenistic or whatnot, versus what it is that you understand about the actual culture. Like, what are those differences? I know that you in your interview with Sarah Johnston, you all did make it a very generous point, I think, to say that both of these groups can work together, and that there is a way of sort of beautifully marrying those concepts, and that concept, that the gods of the past are still the gods of today. They've just kind of evolved. They have continued to live, and they are, that kind of thing. But from your understanding and perspective, what is it that is happening? Is there something wrong with what's happening? What could these folks learn? What's going on there?
Like in terms of the groups, you mean, like, for example, like
these modern pagan folks that are worshiping these deities, that that kind of thing, negotiating these deities for a modern context and modern sensibilities.
I think what in the interview that I did with Sarah Johnston, we've talked about a lot about like respect. And so I think, within paganism and the various, communities or cults, witches, these sorts of things, I think people really need to find proper labels. I'm really into categorization and proper descriptive labels of what's occurring. And so I think what people do is they read and they find in those books specific terms. Like, for example, if you read ancient history, you'll come across the word Hellenism. And it has its earliest meaning. It just talks about language. So Hellenism, Hellenismos, and the Greek word, just talks about proper Greek, speaking, writing, without any errors or flaws. It's a good Greek. And then later it expands, and it kind of includes like the culture itself, like more broadly. And then at some point, Julian, the emperor, is trying to turn the tides in the Roman Empire and try to, get rid of Christianity or kind of like, reverse that stuff. And they didn't have a word for the religion, for their own religion, religious traditions and stuff like that. And so I think he was just trying to find a term to latch onto that people can kind of coalesce around. And he, it's thought that his idea of Hellenism was religion, but I think he was using the term more broadly as the culture itself. And then pagans will see that and say, oh, so the ancient religion, from projecting back again, they take Julian, for example, at the end of like he's at the 4th century Common Era. He uses the term Hellenism. He's the only one to use it in more of a kind of a religious tone. And then say, latch onto that, project it onto the past. Let's go back to Athens of the classical period. This is Hellenism, as a religion. I'm reconstructing it today. I'm doing Hellenism as a pagan because I believe in XYZ gods. They turn it into a faith-based thing. If you believe in Athena and Zeus, you do Hellenism. That's incorrect. That's appropriation because, how many Greeks are around today? Over 10 million, 15 million. And all of us understand what Hellenism is, which is our collective umbrella term for our identity, language, history, all that. So when pagans then take the term and try to create a religion out of it, they're creating a competing, hostile version that's supposed to, they want to harmonize. What's the phrase? Let's just like my Hellenism is different than yours, but that's fine. They want to be able to have it, and like it's okay. It's like you can't do that because it's literally not what that is. So you're changing the definition of a word that people have been using for themselves. Like
you do see a lot of folks that kind of live in that pagan umbrella, whether people call themselves, say that they're practicing traditional witchcraft, whether they say that they're, some flavor of Reconstructionist or something like that. It's this appeal to ancient history. It's this appeal to lineage. It's this appeal to, I'm doing something that's valid and real and true because of how old it is. Look how old it is. And I think that there is this aversion to the admission that what it is that you're doing and the context that you're doing it are all pretty modern. And I think that it should become less of a distasteful thing to admit that, like, hey, we're doing a new modern thing now. I think that's kind of something that a lot of folks, a lot of voices, people like Thorne Mooney have done with other modern religions like Wicca, that is new. Charitably speaking, it's maybe 70 years old, maybe something like that, maybe 80, I don't know. And there is this idea that like, no, we're practicing this unbroken line of witchcraft that goes back 1,000 years to Western Europe and yada, yada, yada. But it's like, no, it's become a much more accepted thing, even though it is still an unpopular opinion. It is still a truth that this is new. This is not ancient,
but it's still valid.
It's still valid. That's the thing, is that I wish people would get out of their own way that just because it's new doesn't mean it's not valid. It's still valid. It's still enriching your life. It's still doing something for you. You can still get something out of it. It just doesn't need to be ancient. Yeah. It doesn't need to be ancient. It's okay. It's okay that it's something that we're all just kind of making up right now. That was something that Sarah Johnston...
It's funny because it's a very human attitude or behavior that we have even back in the ancient world. They always like to, back in the ancient world, anything that was considered ancient and old was considered better or more accurate or, less corrupted from the passage of time where, like the telephone game, so... so even the ancients, they liked ancient things by their standards because they thought it was, it's a very human thing. I think, humans want to avoid the idea of something being an innovation, or.
Yeah, there's that idea that like, I am doing something that people did 2,500 years ago. Well, you're probably not, but that doesn't mean that what you're doing isn't valid and isn't enriching your life in some kind of way.
Exactly. Like there are pagans who like to Platonize their religion, where they take inspiration from Plato and Platonic philosophy. Do I think they're Platonists doing Platonism? No, they're doing Platonistic paganism. That's how I look at it. Like, just let's really look at what you're doing and find an appropriate term that kind of describes what it is really, and just be done with it and move on. And we can actually then have conversations amongst each other. You know, like I see, like what I do in terms of my conversations with pagans, I don't see myself, you know, as a pagan talking to pagans. I don't see myself as a pagan. I'm a Greek. And I feel like I'm having an inter-community dialogue or interfaith dialogue, like a Christian would have with a Buddhist, for example. Like, two separate things, and we're having dialogue with each other. That's what I try to do when I want to have with other people, have a conversation, because we all are interested in these things, you know. But we need to make sure we kind of like have our ducks in order, so we can actually have proper conversations and not get confused with
something that I do similarly is try to get people to understand that, like, when you're talking about the word witch or witchcraft or something like that.
Yeah.
And people will start conflating, oh, well, here's what witches were back then, and here's what they practiced, and here's what they did this and this and this. And they'll start conflating all of these different kinds of stories and ways of telling those stories. And they'll also lump in some folklore and some myth and all of that, and create this like cohesive narrative of what a witch was, instead of accepting the fact that the witch has always been both fact and fiction. There is the fictional witch. There's the witch that is a story character, that is a kind of archetype that appears in stories, which is why, you know, you do see things like people trying to project back this idea of witches in ancient Greek myth or Norse retellings or whatever, even though maybe that concept as we understand it didn't exist. Yeah. But they're trying to create this like cohesive narrative of what a witch was. Well, no. There's always been figures that worked magic upon the world.
Yeah. There's always the person who is marginalized within the broader religious kind of what's accepted in, again, society. What does society of a particular time and place accept as appropriate religious spiritual behavior or practice? And then there were
people that invoked magic to do, you know, to fix the weather, to give them wind in their sails and all of that. Yeah. But it wasn't all this thing that we now call witchcraft.
Yeah.
It wasn't that. It's not that. There's all these different kinds of things.
There's words in culture that, you know, that people like to, you know, correspond to, like the modern words, so like witchcraft or witches. Where's that word in that society, and find the equivalent. So there is that. But again, like, what does it actually entail when you actually approach that culture, and what does that word mean, and what's included, what's not included? Again, you know, that's a culture.
You're bringing up something similar. Mara Starling does that from a Welsh perspective, and she's she'll talk about, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce the word, because Welsh is not a language that I speak, and I'm going to butcher it if I try. But I know that there is a word, like in English, she would say, you know, yes, I'm a witch, I practice witchcraft. But in Welsh, there are multiple words that could mean what we say in English, and she chooses one of them because that is more aligned with what she understands that practice to be, which might not be the more common word. And it's like, well, you're picking out a word that you think, oh, is a person that does a magic. They're a person that does a magic, and then we're just conflating all of these. Like, people will put like shaman in there, or people will put, you know, all these kinds of words and put it together. Anyways, I want to be respectful of your time, so I'm not going to take up too much of it. I know you have a busy day. I do want to ask, do you have a favorite modern retelling or a favorite adaptation of Greek myth?
Oh,
I'm going to give you the out of, I don't necessarily mean it is the most accurate. I mean, do you have one that's just a fun comfort watch? Yeah. Do you have what's your favorite?
Well, I have to be nostalgic. Xena.
Oh, yay.
Xena. I love Xena.
Nostalgic and gay. That's very gay. Xena, as gay as the Greek myths are in and of themselves, Xena really just ratcheted that up. just really just
it was just good.
increased.
It was again very entertaining. I loved it. Was the story and all that. But yeah, I think I had to be Xena. I'm trying to think of if there's anything else that really caught my attention. I think I really liked. I think it was Immortals with Henry Cavill.
Well, didn't we all love that one?
Yeah.
For various different reasons. I don't remember that movie having a plot. I just remember that movie having a nearly naked Henry Cavill the entire time. I do also have a soft spot for the original Clash of the Titans. Mm-hmm. I did love that one. Well, okay, Angelo Nasios, thank you so much for your time. If people want to get a little bit more of you, where can they find you online?
Oh, they can find me on Twitter. Twitter is a good place to find me. I'm very active on Twitter.
And go subscribe to his podcast, Hearth of Hellenism. There aren't a lot of episodes, but each one is a gem.
It's on Substack. Yeah. So I do write. I try to write more than I do with audio. I'm building, some a schedule. So I do have people scheduled, more scholars for future episodes. So I'm hoping to, really build something there and have good conversations with academics to, again, what you talked about earlier about how do people like learn these things and help them. I really want to build a podcast where I could bring the scholars on and ask them those questions and kind of pick their brain. So it would help people learn those things.
Well, thank you so much for your time. You have a good rest of your day.
You too. Thank you so much for having me.
That is going to do it here for this episode of Head on Fire. I would just like to thank once again my guest, Angelo Nasios. Just a quick reminder, if you like this show and you want to support it, and it's Pride Month, so you should be supporting it, there are a number of ways to help. Share it with your friends on social media. You can also like or rate the show 5 stars on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And while you're there, please consider leaving a review. Reviews help recommend the show to other listeners just like you. If you hate the ads, please consider joining my Patreon on a monthly basis. Patrons receive additional audio and video content, as well as archived episodes, a private Discord server, and fun little goodies along the way. I will say, they just got a free book this month. So hey, if you like free books, go sign up for my Patreon at patreon.com/headonfirepod. You can also connect with me on social media. I am at headonfirepod everywhere. Thanks so much for tuning in. Thanks so much for downloading and streaming the show. Thank you so much for your support on social media as of late. It's been kind of nuts, blowing up everywhere. But it's really cool because I have some amazing guests coming up in the next few episodes that I'm really excited to be able to share with you. I'm going to go, but before I do, please remember it's Pride Month. Be gay, do crimes, because that's pretty much the spirit of the Greek gods. That's what they would want. Happy Pride.